September 2016 arrived quietly in Wichita, Kansas. But beneath the calm surface of routine city life, the ground itself was about to give up a secret it had guarded for more than 2 decades. Along the Arkansas riverbank, a long-planned road expansion project was underway, one of those unremarkable infrastructure upgrades that rarely draw attention beyond traffic complaints and construction noise. The area hadn't been disturbed in years, its soil compacted by time and neglect. That morning, an excavator clawed methodically into the earth, each scoop peeling away layers of dirt that hadn't seen daylight since the early 1990s. Then, without warning, the machine shuddered. The bucket struck something solid. Metal rang sharply against metal, producing a sound so out of place it immediately froze the worksite. At first, workers assumed it was debris, perhaps an old pipe or buried scrap from a forgotten project. But as damp soil was pushed aside, the shape became unmistakable. A large metal barrel lay buried deep, its surface corroded by time, its lid sealed tight. This wasn't construction waste. This was deliberate. The site supervisor didn't hesitate. Over the radio, his voice was steady but tense as he called it in. Police, forensics, immediately. When investigators arrived, the barrel was carefully exposed and opened under controlled conditions. Inside were human remains, bound, wrapped, and placed with unsettling care. Whoever had buried them had not only wanted to hide a body, but had intended for it never to be found. The arrangement spoke of planning, patience, and confidence that time would erase all traces. For detectives, the condition of the remains told an immediate story. This was not a recent crime. This was history resurfacing. As forensic teams began their work, a name quietly returned into circulation inside the Wichita Police Department. A name that once dominated headlines before slipping into silence. Linda Parker. In 1992, Linda Parker was 24 years old when she vanished without warning. She left home on a clear September morning, telling her family she had a short appointment in the city. She never returned. There were no screams reported, no confirmed witnesses, no signs of struggle, just an abandoned car near Kellogg Bridge and a trail that went cold almost as quickly as it had begun. For 23 years, Linda's disappearance existed only as a file, yellowing reports, faded photographs, and unanswered questions locked away in storage. Her family waited, the city moved on, and the case slowly became something investigators rarely like to admit exists. Unsolved. But not until now. The discovery along the riverbank did more than confirm a death. It reopened everything. Old statements were pulled, timelines were reconstructed, witnesses long dismissed were reconsidered. And what detectives uncovered was deeply unsettling, not because the killer was unknown, but because they weren't. The person responsible had not vanished. They had lived openly, moved freely, and blended into the community. They had been questioned once, trusted, then released. Modern forensic science, unavailable in 1992, now had a chance to speak, and it spoke clearly. This was not just the resolution of a missing person case, it was a reckoning for a city, for an investigation, and for a truth that refused to stay buried. Linda Parker had been close all along. So had her killer. And as the past began to unravel, detectives realized something chilling. The answer they had searched for over 2 decades had been hiding in plain sight from the very beginning. In the next part, we go back to Wichita in 1992, to the final morning Linda Parker was seen alive, and uncover the seemingly ordinary routine that masked the start of a perfectly planned disappearance.
Wichita, Kansas, September 1992. The city moved at its usual pace, unaware that one ordinary morning would quietly mark the beginning of a mystery that would linger for decades. Traffic flowed steadily along Central Avenue. Storefronts prepared for the weekend rush. The Arkansas River glimmered under a dry, cloudless sky. Nothing about that day hinted at tragedy. Linda Parker woke early in her small College Hill home, the same place she had lived for years with her mother. At 24, Linda's life followed a steady rhythm. She worked regular shifts, met friends on weekends, and rarely deviated from plans without explanation. Those who knew her described her as dependable, almost predictable. That predictability would later become one of the most alarming aspects of her disappearance. On the morning of September 14th, Linda prepared to leave the house just as she always did. She changed clothes carefully, checked the contents of her purse, and grabbed her car keys from the familiar hook near the door. There was no argument, no distress, no sign that anything was wrong. Her mother would later recall that Linda seemed calm, focused, and in no hurry. Around 9 a.m., Linda stepped outside and climbed into her white Chevy Cavalier, an older vehicle but one she trusted. Her plan was simple. She was meeting her best friend at Central Avenue Mall, something they had done countless times before. The route was familiar, the appointment routine. There was no reason to believe this trip would be any different. As Linda drove west from Douglas Avenue towards Central, at least 2 people later reported seeing a car matching her vehicle. One witness near the Douglas and Hillside intersection remembered a white Cavalier passing through, noting the driver's long hair and posture. Another witness working near an electronics store along Central Avenue recalled seeing a similar car turning into the commercial area around 10:15 a.m. Neither could say with certainty that it was Linda, but nothing contradicted the possibility. What is certain is this: Linda never arrived. Her friend waited inside the mall expecting her at their usual spot. Minutes stretched into an hour. Calls went unanswered. At first, irritation gave way to concern. Linda was never late without notice. By early afternoon, worry had settled into something heavier. Back at home, Linda's mother noticed the silence too. The phone never rang, no messages were left. By evening, family members began calling friends and relatives, hoping Linda made an unplanned visit. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her. By 9 p.m., unease turned into fear. The family reviewed Linda's habits again and again, searching for a reasonable explanation. She always checked in, she never stayed out overnight without calling, and she had left that morning with a clear destination and no intention of being gone long. As midnight passed, hope faded. By 2 a.m. on September 15th, the family made the call no one ever wants to make. Wichita police were notified. Linda Parker was officially reported missing. Because of her age, lifestyle, and lack of prior incidents, the case was immediately classified as high concern. There was no indication she had run away, no sign of emotional distress, no history suggesting voluntary disappearance. At sunrise, detectives began piecing together the last known moments of Linda's routine. Departure time, intended route, missed appointment. Everything pointed to a narrow window, just over an hour, during which Linda had vanished without a trace. And somewhere within that quiet slice of time, something had gone terribly wrong. In Part 3, investigators launch an urgent city-wide search, mapping Linda's route, deploying K-9 units, and unknowingly closing in on the first physical clue that would redefine the entire investigation.
By the early morning hours of September 15, 1992, the disappearance of Linda Parker had shifted from a family emergency to a city-wide concern. When the day shift investigation team arrived at the Wichita Police Department shortly after 6 a.m., they were already behind an unforgiving clock. Every hour that passed without contact lowered the chances of a simple explanation. Detectives began where all missing person investigations must: confirmation. Linda's mother was interviewed again, this time in detail. Her account was consistent. Linda left the house around 9 a.m., intending to meet her best friend at Central Avenue Mall around 10:30. She carried no extra clothes, no luggage, and no indication of plans beyond that short outing. There were no arguments, no emotional warning signs, and no known enemies. That consistency raised alarms. People who leave voluntarily usually leave clues. Linda had left none. Using traffic maps from 1992 and patrol experience, investigators outlined every likely route Linda could have taken from Douglas Avenue to Central Avenue Mall. Douglas, Hillside, Central, each road was marked. Intersections were circled. Side streets were noted. The plan was simple. Assume Linda followed her routine until proven otherwise. A Tier 1 search perimeter was established, covering the entire Central Avenue commercial zone and the most direct routes connecting it to Linda's home. Patrol units were divided into teams, each responsible for a defined area. They were instructed to look for anything unusual, abandoned vehicles, dropped personal items, or anyone who remembered seeing a young woman matching Linda's description that morning. A canine unit was deployed early. Dogs were brought to Linda's home to pick up a base scent from personal belongings. From there, handlers led them along the predicted route towards Central Avenue. The goal wasn't to find a crime scene, there wasn't one yet, but to detect any deviation from Linda's normal path. At the same time, detectives canvassed stores and businesses that opened early along Central Avenue. Cashiers, security guards, and maintenance workers were questioned. Most remembered a busy morning. Few remembered a face. Nothing had stood out enough to trigger memory. By 8 a.m., a temporary command post was established in the north parking lot of Central Avenue Mall. Paper maps were spread across folding tables, covered in handwritten notes and colored markings. Areas already searched were shaded in, priority zones were flagged. As word spread, local volunteers began to arrive. Neighbors, friends of the family, people who simply wanted to help. They were organized carefully, paired up, assigned limited zones, warned not to enter industrial areas alone or stray from their sectors. Every finding, no matter how small, was to be reported immediately. Throughout the morning, parking lots were checked one by one. Alleyways behind stores were walked. Pedestrian paths were scanned. Officers looked beneath dumpsters, between buildings, and along less traveled back routes. Still, nothing. By noon, the canine unit had found no clear scent break. The dogs followed the expected route, but failed to identify a definitive point where Linda had stopped, turned, or exited her vehicle. That absence was troubling. It suggested either a very brief interruption or a location not yet considered. With Tier 1 yielding no results, Command made the decision to expand. A Tier 2 perimeter was authorized, extending eastward and southward into areas with lower traffic and less visibility. Roads near older infrastructure were added to the search plan, places where a car could be left unnoticed. It was during this expanded sweep that a patrol unit was redirected to recheck an overlooked stretch near Kellogg Bridge, a transitional zone between highway access and an abandoned industrial lot. And there, quietly resting on a dirt shoulder, sat a white Chevy Cavalier. In Part 4, the discovery of Linda's car shifts the investigation overnight, revealing disturbing details about where it was placed, why it mattered, and what may have happened next. The discovery came late in the afternoon of September 15th, almost by accident. A patrol officer, assigned to recheck secondary roads near Kellogg Bridge, was scanning an area that hadn't initially drawn much attention. The location sat in an uneasy in-between space, neither fully urban nor completely abandoned. It was quiet, partially hidden by the structure of the bridge, and rarely used except for those who knew it was there. That's when the officer saw it. A white car sat angled on the dirt shoulder several dozen meters from the ramp leading up to Kellogg Bridge. It wasn't crashed, it wasn't stuck, it looked placed. When the license plate was run, confirmation came instantly. The vehicle belonged to Linda Parker. Within minutes, the temporary command post at Central Avenue Mall was notified. Patrol cars were redirected. A specialized unit was dispatched to secure the area. What had been a missing persons search now carried the unmistakable weight of a potential crime scene. Officers cordoned off the area, establishing a perimeter wide enough to protect any fragile evidence. No one touched the vehicle. Instead, investigators began with careful observation, documenting everything exactly as it was found. The Chevy Cavalier's doors were closed, the windows were up. There were no visible signs of forced entry or collision damage. The headlights were off. The keys were not visible from the outside. The car was parked slightly off-axis from the roadway, angled in a way that suggested deliberate maneuvering rather than an accidental stop. Its position was troubling. The car was close enough to the pedestrian access near the bridge that someone could leave the area quickly on foot. Yet it was far enough from active traffic lanes to avoid drawing attention. From the bridge above, visibility to the lower shoulder was limited by railings and elevation. It was, investigators noted, an ideal place to abandon a vehicle without being seen. The ground beneath and around the car was examined next. The soil was dry, sandy, and undisturbed by rain in the previous 24 hours, conditions favorable for preserving recent traces. Shallow impressions were visible in several spots near the passenger side and rear of the vehicle. They were irregular and indistinct, possibly footprints, possibly unrelated. Still, every mark was photographed and measured. Nearby grass showed signs of compression, flattened in small patches that suggested movement through the area. But this location wasn't entirely used. Pedestrians occasionally cut through here. No single detail could yet be confirmed as significant. Environmental conditions were logged. Light wind from the south, clear weather, no recent erosion. Investigators concluded that if someone had exited the vehicle and moved away on foot, limited evidence might still exist within a close radius. With that in mind, the search perimeter shifted again. Teams were dispatched outward from the car in a controlled radius. One group followed the base of the bridge, where low bushes and dirt paths led toward an abandoned industrial lot. Another team moved up the ramp toward the bridge itself, checking pedestrian walkways and shoulders. A third unit headed east toward old rail beds and overgrown drainage ditches. As these teams worked, detectives at the scene continued analyzing the car's placement. There were no signs Linda had slept in the vehicle, no visible personal items left behind in plain sight. Nothing suggested she had intended to leave the car there herself. The overwhelming impression was chilling. Linda had not parked here by choice. The Chevy Cavalier became more than a clue. It became a dividing line. Everything before it was routine. Everything after it was unknown. And somewhere beyond that quiet shoulder, answers waited. Rehook. In Part 5, search teams uncovered disturbing signs around the bridge, flattened grass, soil disturbances, and a witness whose strange account introduces a shadowy figure into the investigation.
With Linda Parker's car now confirmed at Kellogg Bridge, the investigation entered a far more unsettling phase. What had once been a broad, hopeful search narrowed into a focused examination of a place few people noticed and even fewer lingered. The bridge area was quiet, isolated and layered with terrain that could easily hide movement, exactly the kind of environment investigators feared. Search teams moved methodically, each assigned a specific direction radiating out from the abandoned Chevy Cavalier. Their goal was simple but urgent: determine whether Linda had left the vehicle on her own, been forced from it, or if something far worse had occurred nearby. The first team headed toward the old railbed that ran parallel to the bridge. The gravel surface there was uneven, scattered with loose stones and patches of dirt. At first glance, it appeared untouched, but closer inspection revealed several sections where the gravel had been displaced sideways, forming shallow drag-like marks stretching a few meters. The impressions weren't clear enough to definitively indicate human movement, but they didn't align naturally with animal tracks or vehicle runoff. The area was flagged for closer forensic review. The second team followed the drainage ditch that ran along the base of the bridge. It was mostly dry, lined with compacted soil, dead leaves, and debris that had settled over time. In one section near a dirt road leading toward the abandoned industrial lot, officers noticed something unusual: a wide patch of soil that appeared unevenly compressed. It stood out sharply from the surrounding ground, as though weight had been applied and then removed. Within this disturbed patch were several vague depressions, too faint to classify confidently, but close enough together to suggest movement rather than chance. Measurements were taken. Photographs documented the angle and depth. The time frame was crucial. Given the dry conditions, these disturbances could plausibly have occurred within the last 24 to 36 hours. The third group searched near one of the bridge's support pillars, an area partially hidden by tall grass and shadow. Foot traffic there was rare, making any disturbance more noticeable. It was here that officers found a narrow unofficial path, grass pressed down in a strip roughly 4 to 5 meters long, angling toward the open lot beyond the bridge. The flattened grass hadn't yet sprung back. That detail mattered. Fresh compression suggested recent use, likely close to the time of Linda's disappearance. The path was marked and added to the growing scene map, connecting several of the disturbances identified by different teams. While the physical search continued, one officer was tasked with speaking to people who occasionally occupied the bridge area. Truck drivers sometimes parked nearby. A few unhoused individuals sheltered in the shade during the day. Their accounts were unpredictable, but detectives knew that overlooked witnesses often held overlooked truths. One man, elderly and soft-spoken, claimed he had been resting near the bridge around midday the previous day. He said he noticed a man moving quickly through the area, something that caught his attention because people rarely passed that way. According to his account, the man wore dark clothing and a fedora-style hat. The witness couldn't describe the man's face clearly. Distance and angle made that impossible, but he was firm about the hat. It stood out as unusual, almost deliberate. The man, he said, didn't stop or look around. He walked with purpose, turning onto the same flattened path the search team had just identified. Investigators treated the statement cautiously. The witness couldn't provide an exact time, and his reliability couldn't be confirmed. Still, the overlap between his account and the physical signs on the ground was difficult to ignore. By late afternoon, all findings were brought back to command. None of the evidence alone proved what had happened, but together they painted a troubling picture. Movement away from Linda's car toward an isolated area shortly after her disappearance. The bridge base was no longer just a parking spot. It was now the most likely point where Linda's routine ended and something darker began.
By the evening of September 15th, the investigation into Linda Parker's disappearance had reached a critical crossroads. Search teams had uncovered signs of movement near Kellogg Bridge, but no direct evidence explaining what had happened to Linda herself. With daylight fading and physical searches yielding only fragments, detectives shifted focus to something just as important: time. If they could understand Linda's final hours, they might understand who had crossed her path. Investigators began reconstructing Linda's activities starting 48 hours before she vanished. This wasn't about suspicion, it was about context. Every confirmed moment was placed on a timeline, each uncertain period marked clearly. The goal was to separate what was known from what was assumed. According to her mother, Friday, September 12th, had been unremarkable. Linda worked her scheduled shift, returned home around 3:30 p.m., and spent the evening inside. She made no unusual phone calls. She didn't leave the house again that night. Her mood appeared normal, relaxed even. Saturday followed the same pattern. Linda ran a few errands during the day, spoke briefly with friends, and mentioned her plan to meet her best friend at Central Avenue Mall on Sunday morning. Nothing in her words suggested fear or hesitation. She had no appointments that required secrecy, no plans that raised concern. Phone records were limited in 1992, but detectives confirmed there were no unusual outgoing calls late Saturday night, no evidence of distress, no sudden change in behavior. That absence of warning signs troubled detectives. People planning to disappear often display subtle shifts: withdrawal, secrecy, emotional distance. Linda had shown none of them. Everything pointed toward interruption, not intention. Next, investigators reviewed Linda's social circle. Friends, co-workers, relatives, each was interviewed again. The questions were precise. Had Linda mentioned anyone new? Had she expressed concern about being followed? Had she talked about meeting someone else that morning? The answers were consistent. Linda had not expressed fear. She had not mentioned conflicts. She had not planned any meetings beyond the mall. Attention then turned to her routine. Linda was predictable in the best way. She took the same routes, shopped at the same places, met the same people. That predictability made her life stable, but it also made her vulnerable. Detectives began considering an uncomfortable possibility. What if someone had known exactly where Linda would be and when? Investigators reviewed early witness statements again, paying close attention to timing. The last possible sighting of Linda's car placed her near Central Avenue around 10:25 a.m. The vehicle was later found near Kellogg Bridge, a location that didn't align with her intended destination. That gap between leaving home and the abandoned car was narrow, too narrow for coincidence. Detectives asked a new set of questions. Could Linda have been flagged down? Could she have recognized someone and pulled over voluntarily? Was there a reason she might have trusted a familiar face enough to deviate from her route? The idea was unsettling, but increasingly plausible. As the timeline sharpened, another realization emerged. The area where Linda's car was found wasn't random. It required local knowledge, awareness of low traffic, limited visibility, and quick escape routes. Whoever left the car there knew the area. By nightfall, investigators concluded that Linda's disappearance was unlikely to be spontaneous. The absence of panic signs, the precise placement of her vehicle, and the controlled movement away from the scene all suggested planning. Not a crime of opportunity, a crime of intention. And somewhere in Linda's past, her routine, her trust, her familiarity was the key to identifying who had taken advantage of it. With the timeline narrowed and the evidence around Kellogg Bridge pointing toward deliberate planning, investigators faced a sobering truth. Whoever took Linda Parker had likely known her routine. That realization shifted the direction of the investigation once again. Random suspects faded into the background. Familiar faces moved forward. Detectives began systematically re-interviewing everyone who had been close to Linda in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Friends were asked not just what Linda had said, but how she had said it. Co-workers were questioned about who lingered, who asked questions, who paid unusual attention to her schedule. Even casual acquaintances were reconsidered. Most interviews led nowhere. The stories matched previous statements. Emotions were raw but consistent. No contradictions, no obvious red flags. Then, a name surfaced. It wasn't new. In fact, it had been present in the original 1992 file, mentioned briefly, questioned once, and then set aside. At the time, there hadn't been enough evidence to pursue it further. Now, with fresh eyes and a clearer understanding of Linda's routine, that name felt different. The individual had known Linda well enough to recognize her car, well enough to know her habits, well enough to approach her without raising immediate alarm. Back in 1992, detectives had spoken to this person early in the investigation. The interview had been uneventful. The alibi had seemed plausible. There were no witnesses placing them near Kellogg Bridge, and without physical evidence, the trail had gone cold. But cold cases have a way of warming up when context changes. As detectives reviewed the old interview transcripts, subtle details stood out. Statements that had once seemed harmless now felt carefully worded. Timelines that appeared tight now showed small but significant gaps. The alibi relied heavily on self-reporting, no independent verification, no supporting witnesses. More importantly, this individual lived close enough to Kellogg Bridge to understand its isolation. They would have known where a car could be left unnoticed. They would have known how quickly someone could disappear into the surrounding terrain. Investigators quietly began background work, employment history, daily routines, any changes around September 1992. They discovered that shortly after Linda's disappearance, this person's behavior had shifted, subtle but present. A job change, increased isolation, a move that placed physical distance between them and familiar faces. None of it proved guilt, but none of it felt accidental either. Investigators also re-examined witness statements from the bridge area. The man in the fedora, the quick movement, the chosen path. Could those details align with someone already known to police? Could the figure seen that day have been hiding in plain sight? As these questions mounted, investigators realized something unsettling. In 1992, they had been looking outward, searching for strangers, drifters, unknown threats. What if the danger had been inward all along? Someone Linda trusted, someone who didn't need force, someone who had been given just one interview and then allowed to walk away. Now, more than 22 years later, that decision was being reconsidered. In Part 8, detectives dig deeper into the suspect's past and uncover inconsistencies that modern forensic science will soon put to the ultimate test. Once the familiar name resurfaced, the investigation took on a quiet intensity. Detectives were careful not to alert the suspect or the public. This phase wasn't about confrontation, it was about verification. Every statement from 1992 was reopened, not to accuse, but to test whether it could still stand under modern scrutiny. The original alibi had sounded reasonable at the time. The suspect claimed to have spent the morning of September 14th engaged in routine activities, errands, time at home, nothing unusual. In 1992, without surveillance footage, GPS data, or digital footprints, investigators had little choice but to accept what they couldn't disprove. But now, the absence of evidence was no longer enough. Detectives began reconstructing the suspect's timeline minute by minute, just as they had done with Linda's. They compared work schedules, travel distances, and known habits. The first issue emerged quickly. The suspect's claimed movements left unexplained windows of time, short but significant, long enough to encounter Linda, long enough to reach Kellogg Bridge. Next came geography. The suspect's familiarity with the area wasn't incidental. Records showed frequent travel near the bridge and surrounding industrial lots, both before and after Linda's disappearance. To someone unfamiliar with Wichita's less visible routes, the location would have seemed random. To this person, it was strategic. Investigators also reviewed personal relationships. Linda and the suspect shared a history, one that wasn't widely known outside a small circle. There had been trust once, communication, a connection that explained why Linda might have stopped her car without fear. Then there was behavior after the disappearance. Detectives noted that the suspect had participated minimally in search efforts, not absent but distant, cooperative yet detached. In hindsight, it felt calculated. Enough involvement to avoid suspicion, not enough to risk exposure. The most significant development came when forensic teams completed preliminary analysis of the remains found in the barrel. Though time had degraded much of the evidence, enough biological material remained to confirm identity. The remains were Linda Parker's. With confirmation came a renewed push. The way the body had been bound and concealed indicated planning, strength, and access to materials. Investigators compared this with what they now knew about the suspect's background, and the overlap was disturbing. Modern forensic methods offered one final opportunity. Trace evidence recovered from the barrel and remnants of the bindings were examined using techniques unavailable in 1992. Fibers, residue, microscopic details once considered useless now carried meaning. Investigators knew the moment was approaching when theory would become fact. But before that happened, they needed one thing: an explanation from the suspect that could survive modern evidence. And increasingly, it appeared that explanation no longer existed. Rehook. In Part 9, forensic results return with findings that detectives in 1992 could only have dreamed of, results that pushed a case past the point of doubt and toward an inevitable confrontation.
When the forensic reports began arriving, the tone inside the investigation room changed. For more than 20 years, the Linda Parker case had relied on assumptions, witness recollections, and incomplete timelines. Now, science, precise, indifferent, and unforgiving, was finally stepping in where memory had failed. The barrel recovered from the Arkansas River bank had been severely corroded, but its contents still held answers. Forensic specialists focused first on the bindings used to restrain Linda's remains. The material was aged, brittle, and partially degraded, yet distinct. Fiber analysis revealed manufacturing patterns consistent with commercially available cords from the early 1990s. This wasn't improvised with whatever was nearby, it had been selected. Microscopic examination uncovered trace fibers embedded in the bindings and remnants of fabric wrapped around the remains. When compared against control samples taken from known environments connected to the suspect, similarities began to emerge. Not definitive on their own, but consistent, enough to raise alarms. Then came soil comparison. The interior of the barrel contained compacted soil residue that didn't fully match the riverbank where it was found. That suggested the barrel had been buried elsewhere first, or at least stored in a different environment before final placement. When soil samples from locations historically linked to the suspect were tested, analysts found striking overlaps in mineral composition and organic matter. Then came the most powerful confirmation. DNA analysis, once impossible due to degradation, had advanced enough to extract partial profiles. Those fragments were cross-referenced with familial samples provided by Linda's relatives. The match was undeniable. The remains were hers. That confirmation transformed the investigation legally. Linda Parker was no longer missing, she was a homicide victim. With that determination, detectives revisited the suspect's 1992 statements one last time, this time side by side with the forensic findings. Where the suspect had claimed never to be near industrial zones, soil evidence suggested otherwise. Where they had denied access to storage materials, the bindings told a different story. And then came the behavioral contradiction. Investigators discovered that shortly after Linda's disappearance, the suspect had disposed of several large items under the pretense of moving. At the time, no one questioned it. Now, that disposal lined up disturbingly well with the estimated time frame of Linda's death and concealment. Each piece of evidence alone might have been explainable. Together, they formed a narrative that could no longer be ignored. The investigation team met behind closed doors. The decision was unanimous. It was time. But detectives knew confrontation required precision. A premature move could collapse everything. They needed the suspect to talk, not defensively, not with rehearsed answers, but with the confidence of someone who believed the truth had stayed buried forever. Arrangements were made carefully. A voluntary interview, no accusations, just questions. Because sometimes the weight of the past becomes too heavy to carry. And when the suspect finally sat down across from detectives again, more than 22 years after that first interview, they had no idea how much the world had changed, or how close the truth was to finally being spoken aloud. Rehook. In Part 10, detectives bring the suspect back into the interview room where carefully placed questions and one unexpected detail begin to unravel a secret kept for over 23 years.
Part 10. The second interview. The interview room looked the same as it always had. Plain walls, a small table, 2 chairs and a camera quietly recording everything. But for the detectives involved, this meeting carried the weight of 23 unanswered years. The suspect, older now, walked in with an air of casual cooperation, unaware that the balance of power had shifted. The invitation had been framed carefully. No accusations, no urgency, just a request to clarify a few things related to the renewed investigation. The suspect agreed without hesitation. That confidence alone was telling. Detectives began with familiar ground, basic questions about life in 1992, work routines, where the suspect lived, how they spent their days. The answers flowed easily, rehearsed by time and repetition, the same story, the same tone, the same careful neutrality. Then the questions narrowed. They asked about Linda. The suspect described her calmly, friendly, responsible, dependable, nothing unusual. No conflicts, no tension. The description aligned with what others had said. But detectives noticed something subtle, emotional distance. Linda was spoken about as an idea, not a person. Next came the timeline. Detectives asked the suspect to walk through the morning of September 14th again, slowly, in detail. What time did you wake up? Where did you go first? How long were you there? Each answer was acknowledged, then revisited from a slightly different angle minutes later. That's when cracks began to form. Small inconsistencies surfaced, not dramatic contradictions, but variations. A stop that lasted about 10 minutes became maybe 20. A route taken shifted slightly. A detail added, then forgotten. Detectives didn't interrupt. They let the silence do the work. Then came the unexpected detail. One detective casually mentioned Kellogg Bridge, not accusingly, just as part of general questioning about the city. The suspect's body language changed almost imperceptibly. A pause, a slight shift in posture. The eyes blinked faster. The suspect denied being in the area that day, said they rarely went near the bridge. That denial was noted. Later in the interview, detectives referenced abandoned industrial lots,
asking broadly if the suspect ever passed through such areas. The suspect answered quickly this time, too quickly. Another denial, firmer, less relaxed. By the end of the session, the suspect appeared unsettled, still cooperative, still polite, but no longer at ease. After the interview concluded, detectives reviewed the footage carefully. They compared the suspect's statements with forensic findings, movement patterns, and historical records. The inconsistencies, once minor, now carried weight. The suspect had lied, not about everything, but about the most important details. And liars, detectives knew, rarely stop lying once they start. What they needed now was leverage, something undeniable, something the suspect couldn't explain away. And that something was already waiting in a lab report. Rehook. In Part 11, detectives reveal a key piece of forensic evidence that changes the tone of the investigation and forces the suspect into a corner they never expected to face.
The days following the second interview were marked by quiet urgency. Detectives knew they were close, closer than the Linda Parker case had ever been. But proximity to the truth can be dangerous. One wrong move could send the suspect retreating behind lawyers and silence. The next step had to be precise. That step arrived in the form of a finalized forensic report. The lab had completed advanced analysis on trace materials recovered from the barrel and the bindings used to restrain Linda. Among the fibers was one type that stood out, not because it was rare, but because it was specific. It matched the composition of industrial-grade rope used by only a small number of suppliers in the early 1990s. Investigators traced those suppliers. Records showed that the suspect's workplace at the time routinely stocked that exact type of rope. More than that, employees were allowed to take excess materials home. No logs, no tracking, just trust. The connection was circumstantial but strong. Then came another finding. Microscopic paint flecks were discovered on the interior rim of the barrel. When analyzed, they matched paint used on storage drums commonly found in private workshops and garages, not construction sites. Investigators cross-referenced this with property records from the suspect's former residence. That residence included a detached garage. Neighbors from the time were located and interviewed. One remembered seeing large metal containers stored inside the garage briefly in the early 1990s. Another recalled the sound of heavy objects being moved late at night during the weeks following Linda's disappearance. None of these details had seemed important then. Now they aligned too well. Detectives brought the suspect in again, not for an interrogation, but for a follow-up conversation. This time, the tone was different, firmer, more direct. They laid out the evidence slowly. The rope, the barrel type, the soil, the timeline inconsistencies. Each point was presented calmly, without accusation. The suspect listened, arms crossed, expression controlled. Then, detectives did something intentional. They stopped talking. Silence filled the room. The suspect shifted in their seat, asked a question that wasn't really a question, tried to reframe a detail, but the explanations were thin, fragile. Finally, detectives asked the one question that mattered most. If Linda trusted you enough to stop her car, why didn't you tell us that in 1992? There was no immediate answer. For the first time, the suspect looked away. That moment, brief, almost invisible, was everything detectives needed to see. The truth was pressing in, and the suspect knew it. What followed wouldn't be a dramatic confession, not yet, but the carefully maintained wall was cracking, and once it cracked, it wouldn't hold. Rehook. In Part 12, pressure mounts as detectives confront the suspect with a reconstructed crime theory, one that reveals how Linda's trust may have been used against her in the final moments before she vanished. By the time detectives prepared for the next interview, the Linda Parker case had transformed from fragments into a nearly complete picture. What had once been speculation was now supported by timelines, forensic data, and behavioral analysis. The remaining challenge was simple, but difficult. They needed the suspect to confront the truth. This time, the interview wasn't framed as casual conversation. It was structured, deliberate, and anchored to a reconstructed theory of what happened on the morning of September 14, 1992. Detectives walked the suspect through it, step by step, not as an accusation, but as an explanation. They proposed that Linda left her home as planned, driving towards Central Avenue Mall. Somewhere along her route, she encountered someone she recognized, someone she trusted enough to slow down, maybe even pull over. There was no struggle at the car, no panic, just familiarity. Detectives suggested that Linda had been convinced to follow the suspect or to stop briefly, under a believable pretense, a question, a favor, something simple. From there, they explained, control shifted. The location near Kellogg Bridge wasn't random. It offered isolation, limited visibility, and quick escape routes. Once there, Linda was likely restrained quickly, preventing noise or resistance. Her car was then deliberately parked in a way that suggested abandonment rather than accident. The suspect listened without interrupting. Detectives continued. They theorized that Linda was transported to another location, one known only to the person who planned the act, a private space, a garage, somewhere time and sound wouldn't matter. That was where the bindings, the barrel, and the concealment came into play. Finally, detectives addressed the burial. The barrel wasn't hidden impulsively. It was sealed, transported, and buried in soil that wouldn't be disturbed for years. The location chosen would eventually be covered by routine development, something no one in 1992 could have predicted, but something the suspect may have assumed would remain untouched. Throughout the explanation, detectives watched the suspect closely. There were no denials this time, no corrections, no insistence that the theory was wrong, just silence. At the end, detectives offered the suspect a choice, not legally, but morally. "This is your chance to explain," one detective said, "because the evidence already has." The suspect's composure began to slip. Hands trembled slightly. Breathing slowed, then quickened. The confidence that had defined the first interview was gone. Still, there was no confession. But something had changed. The suspect now understood what detectives understood. The past had caught up, and there would be no hiding from it this time. Rehook. In Part 13, a single overlooked detail from 1992 resurfaces, one that forces the suspect to confront a memory they had hoped was lost forever. As the investigation pressed forward, detectives returned once more to the original 1992 case file, not to reread it, but to dissect it, page by page, line by line. They weren't looking for what had been recorded, they were looking for what had been overlooked. Cold cases often hinge on small details, the kind dismissed as insignificant at the time, but devastating when re-examined with context. And that detail finally surfaced. Buried deep in an early patrol report was a brief note, only 2 sentences long, written during the first week after Linda Parker vanished. It mentioned a witness who had come forward voluntarily, claiming to have seen Linda speaking with someone near her car on the morning she disappeared. The description was vague, the timing uncertain. The report had been marked low reliability and quietly set aside. But now, with everything else in place, it demanded attention. Detectives located the witness, older now, memory faded but not gone. When shown a photograph of Linda, Recognition came immediately. The witness described seeing her near a roadside pull-off, appearing calm, engaged in conversation, no signs of distress, no raised voices. And then came the detail. The witness recalled that the person Linda was speaking to wore a hat. Not just any hat, a fedora-style hat. The room went quiet. This wasn't new information, it was corroboration. The homeless man near Kellogg Bridge had described a fedora-wearing figure moving quickly through the area around the same time. Two independent accounts, two locations, one consistent feature. Detectives revisited the suspect's history. Photographs from the early 1990s showed the suspect frequently wearing hats, particularly fedoras. Friends at the time had even joked about it being a signature style. When detectives brought this detail into the next interview, the effect was immediate. They didn't accuse, they didn't push, they simply asked, "Do you remember owning a fedora in 1992? The suspect hesitated. A long pause followed. "Yes," came the answer, "a long time ago." Detectives let the silence stretch again. Then they asked another question, one that cut deeper. "Do you remember speaking to Linda near her car that morning?" The suspect's face changed. Not panic, not anger. Recognition. In that moment, something internal shifted. The suspect realized that what they believed had been forgotten, what they had trusted time to erase, had survived in fragments, waiting patiently to be assembled. The fedora wasn't evidence on its own, but it tied witnesses together. It bridged the gap between Linda's final moments and the movement away from Kellogg Bridge. It connected trust to opportunity. And it destroyed the last safe lie. The suspect asked for a break. Detectives granted it, because they knew what came next wouldn't be about evidence anymore. It would be about truth. In Part 14, after requesting a private moment, the suspect returns with a decision, one that finally brings Linda Parker's story out of silence and into the light.
The interview room sat empty for several minutes after the suspect asked for a break. The camera continued to record, capturing nothing but silence and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Detectives remained outside, saying little. They understood this moment well. When a suspect asks for time, it is rarely about rest. It is about memory catching up. When the door finally opened, the person who stepped back inside was no longer composed. Shoulders sagged slightly. The confidence that had carried them through decades of silence had thinned, worn down by details that refused to stay buried. Detectives resumed their seats without speaking. The suspect broke the silence. They didn't confess, not yet. Instead, they spoke about 1992, about Wichita, about how different life had been. The words came slowly, cautiously, as though testing whether the past was safe to touch. They spoke of routine, of familiarity, of knowing the city's quiet places better than most. Then came Linda. The suspect acknowledged seeing her that morning. Not accidentally, not briefly. They admitted to recognizing her car and approaching her. They claimed the interaction had been innocent, a conversation, nothing more. They insisted Linda had been calm, cooperative, trusting. That word lingered in the air. Detectives asked one question: why Kellogg Bridge? The suspect didn't answer immediately. When they did, their voice was barely above a whisper. They spoke of isolation, of knowing where people didn't look, of believing that once something was hidden long enough, it stopped existing. The admission wasn't a full confession, but it crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The suspect had placed themselves at the critical location, at the critical time, with the critical person. From there, the story unraveled. They described parking the car, described walking away, described believing they had been careful, that no one had noticed, that no one would ever connect the dots. What they didn't describe, what they couldn't yet say, was what happened after. Detectives didn't push, they didn't interrupt. They let the suspect speak until the words ran out. Then one detective slid a photograph across the table. It was the barrel, rust-eaten, open, silent. The suspect stared at it for a long time. Tears didn't come. Instead, there was resignation. "Is it still there?" the suspect asked. That single question confirmed everything. The barrel had never been meant to be found. It had been placed where time would do the rest. Roads would be built, soil would settle, life would move on. But time had failed them. Detectives ended the interview shortly after. There was no need to continue. What mattered had been said. What remained would now be handled in courtrooms, not interview rooms. For Linda Parker, the silence was finally breaking. In Part 15, authorities move swiftly to make an arrest, and the community of Wichita begins to confront a truth that had lived quietly among them for over 2 decades.
The decision to act came quickly after the final interview. Detectives knew that hesitation could unravel months of careful work. The suspect had placed themselves at the center of the timeline, acknowledged contact with Linda Parker, and revealed knowledge no innocent person should possess. What had once been circumstantial had now become compelling. Within hours, paperwork moved through the system. Prosecutors reviewed summaries, forensic reports, interview footage, and decades-old notes that now carried new meaning. The conclusion was unavoidable. There was probable cause to arrest. When officers arrived to take the suspect into custody, there was no resistance, no dramatic flight, no denial. The moment unfolded quietly, almost eerily so. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the person they had known for years was led away in handcuffs. The news spread fast. By the next morning, Wichita awoke to headlines many thought they would never read. Linda Parker's case, long dormant, often forgotten, was back, and it was no longer unsolved. The suspect was not a stranger from out of town, not a drifter, not an unknown threat. It was someone who had lived among them, worked among them, shared sidewalks and conversations. Shock gave way to disbelief. People searched their memories for signs they might have missed. Small interactions now felt heavier. Friendly gestures felt unsettling in hindsight. How could someone capable of hiding such a secret go unnoticed for so long? For Linda's family, the arrest brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, grief, anger, all colliding at once. After 23 years of unanswered questions, there was finally movement. But justice, they knew, would not erase loss. At the police department, detectives prepared for the next phase, building a case that could withstand scrutiny in court. Confessions fade, memories blur, evidence must speak clearly. They reassembled everything: the timeline, the placement of the car, the forensic links, the witness accounts, the fedora, the barrel. Each element was layered carefully, creating a narrative that showed planning, opportunity, and concealment. Prosecutors focused heavily on intent. This was not an impulsive act. The use of restraints, the barrel, the burial location, all of it pointed to forethought. The suspect hadn't panicked, they had calculated. As details emerged publicly, the community began to understand the scale of what had happened. Linda's disappearance had not been a mystery born of chaos. It had been engineered by someone who believed time would protect them. But time, it turned out, was the one thing they could not control. As the suspect awaited formal charges, investigators returned to the Arkansas riverbank one final time, not to search, but to reflect. A place that once held a secret had now become a marker of truth. Linda Parker's name was no longer confined to a file. It was being spoken again. And for the first time in decades, it was being spoken with answers. Rehook. In Part 16, as the case moves toward trial, chilling new details emerge. Details that reveal just how close the truth had been in 1992 and how one missed opportunity allowed a killer to walk free for years. As the case against the suspect moved steadily toward trial, investigators began preparing for an uncomfortable task, examining not just what had happened to Linda Parker, but what had almost happened in 1992. Building a strong prosecution required honesty, and that meant confronting the moments where the truth had come dangerously close to the surface and then slipped away. Detectives revisited the earliest days of the original investigation, replaying decisions made under pressure, limited technology, and incomplete information. Back then, Wichita PD had acted quickly by the standards of the time. Searches were launched, witnesses interviewed, the car was found. But something critical had been missing: certainty. In 1992, the suspect had been interviewed within days of Linda's disappearance. That fact alone now felt haunting. At the time, officers had noted the suspect's calm demeanor, cooperative tone, and willingness to answer questions. Nothing in the conversation had screamed danger. In fact, the suspect had seemed helpful, almost eager to assist. Looking back, that eagerness felt different. One retired detective, now consulted for trial preparation, admitted something difficult. "We were looking for panic," he said. "We didn't consider how controlled someone could be." In those early interviews, the suspect had provided just enough detail to appear transparent, but not enough to be tested. Their timeline had included vague errands, flexible hours, and unverified stops, elements that today would raise alarms, but then passed without challenge. Technology had played a role too. There were no traffic cameras tracking movement, no cell phone data mapping locations, no DNA tools capable of extracting meaning from degraded evidence. Investigators had relied on instinct, and instinct had failed them. One particularly chilling discovery came when detectives re-examined patrol logs from the bridge area. An officer had driven past Kellogg Bridge on the afternoon of September 14th, less than an hour after Linda's car was likely abandoned. At the time, nothing appeared out of place. The vehicle blended into the background of neglect and quiet. Had that officer stopped? Had the car been checked? Had the right question been asked? Everything might have changed. Prosecutors knew the defense would raise these points, suggesting doubt, mistakes, missed chances. But instead of weakening the case, these admissions strengthened it. They showed why the suspect had gotten away with it and why they wouldn't again. More unsettling details continued to surface. Records revealed the suspect had been briefly considered a person of interest, but deprioritized due to lack of physical evidence. The case file noted no immediate cause for further inquiry. That sentence echoed loudly now. The truth was close enough to touch, but it wasn't close enough to prove. As trial preparations continued, one thing became clear. This case wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about acknowledging the limits of the past and the power of persistence. Linda Parker had not been forgotten. She had been waiting. In Part 17, the trial begins, and as prosecutors present their case, the courtroom learns just how carefully the truth had been hidden in plain sight for more than 20 decades. The courtroom was full long before the trial officially began. Reporters lined the back rows, members of the public filled the benches, and in the front sat Linda Parker's family, older now, changed by time, but finally facing the person they believed had stolen their daughter, their sister, their future. For the prosecution, this was not just a case, it was a reconstruction of silence. They began where the story had started, September 14, 1992. Jurors were walked through Linda's ordinary morning, her predictable routine, and the narrow window in which she disappeared. Maps were displayed, showing her intended route and the deviation that led to Kellogg Bridge. Then came the car. Photographs of the white Chevy Cavalier appeared on a large screen. The prosecution explained its deliberate placement, the lack of collision damage, and why investigators believed Linda had not parked it herself. Jurors listened as experts described how the location allowed someone to leave without being seen. Then came the forensic testimony. Analysts explained how trace fibers, soil composition, and material comparisons connected the barrel, the bindings, and the suspect's known environments. The science was careful, measured, and precise. This was not speculation. This was probability stacked upon probability until doubt thinned. The courtroom grew quieter as witnesses testified. One by one, individuals from 1992 returned, older, voices steadier but heavier. A former co-worker recalled how the suspect knew Linda's schedule. A neighbor described seeing large metal containers moved late at night. A witness spoke about seeing Linda speaking calmly with someone near her car. And then came the fedora. The prosecution introduced the hat detail not as drama, but as consistency. 2 witnesses, 2 locations, 1 visual anchor. Photographs from the suspect's past showed them wearing the same style repeatedly. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. The final blow came from interview footage. Jurors watched the suspect's second and third interviews. They saw the pauses, the shifts in posture, the moment when the barrel photograph was placed on the table. The question, is it still there? No explanation followed that question. None was needed. The defense attempted to argue the passage of time, the degradation of memory, the absence of a full confession. But the prosecution reminded the jury that crimes don't disappear just because they aren't solved immediately. They closed with one sentence that lingered in the room. Time hid this crime, but it also preserved it. As the trial recessed for deliberation, no one spoke, not to reporters, not to each other. The truth had finally been spoken aloud. Now, it was up to 12 people to decide whether it would be recognized. Rehook. In Part 18, the jury delivers its verdict, and the outcome forces Wichita to confront the final chapter of a story decades in the making. The wait felt longer than it was. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and carefully reconstructed timelines, the jury was escorted from the courtroom to deliberate. The door closed quietly behind them, sealing off a decision that had been delayed for more than 2 decades. For Linda Parker's family, the hours that followed were some of the heaviest they had ever endured. Outside the courtroom, Wichita held its breath. Inside the jury room, the discussion began methodically. Jurors reviewed evidence piece by piece: maps, forensic charts, witness statements, and interview transcripts. They revisited the timeline again and again, tracing Linda's final movements and comparing them to the suspect's shifting explanations. What stood out wasn't one single piece of evidence, but how tightly everything fit together. There were questions, of course. Time had passed. Memories had faded. The defense emphasized those gaps repeatedly, but the prosecution had prepared for that argument. Jurors were reminded that the most critical evidence, the barrel, the bindings, the forensic traces, and the suspect's own admissions, had not aged in uncertainty. They had only waited. One juror later described the moment clarity arrived. It wasn't about whether something could be explained away, they said. It was about how much had to be explained away for the suspect to be innocent. That burden was too heavy. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the silence was absolute. Linda's family stood as the foreperson rose. The suspect stared straight ahead, expression unreadable. The verdict was delivered clearly. Guilty. There was no outburst, no gasp, just a quiet release of breath from those who had waited decades for a word that finally matched the truth. Linda's family held each other. Some cried, some didn't. Closure, they would later say, was not a feeling, it was permission to stop wondering. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for a later date. The suspect was remanded into custody immediately, no longer protected by uncertainty or time. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked the same question again and again. Why now? Why had it taken 23 years? The answer was simple and uncomfortable. Because some truths need time to surface, and some people rely on that. For Wichita, the verdict marked the end of a long chapter, but not the end of reflection. The case had shown how easily certainty can slip through the cracks and how patience, persistence, and science can close them again. Linda Parker's name was spoken that day not as a mystery, but as a victim who had finally been heard. Rehook. In Part 19, sentencing reveals chilling new details about motive and mindset, details that explain how the crime was hidden for so long and why justice nearly never came at all. Sentencing hearings are often quieter than trials, but in the Linda Parker case, the courtroom felt heavier than ever. Guilt had already been established. What remained was understanding, not for sympathy, but for truth. The judge allowed limited statements, opening a final window into the mindset behind a crime that had remained hidden for more than 2 decades. Prosecutors began by outlining the full scope of the crime, not just what happened, but how carefully it had been concealed. They emphasized planning, restraint, and post-crime behavior. This was not an act of sudden rage. It was a calculated decision followed by years of deliberate silence. Then came motive. While no single explanation could justify what happened, prosecutors described a pattern rooted in control. Linda's predictability, her trust, and her familiarity with the suspect had created opportunity. The suspect hadn't needed force at first, only access. Experts explained how some offenders rely not on violence alone, but on manipulation. Trust becomes the weapon, silence becomes the shield. The suspect was given the opportunity to speak. When they stood, the room tightened. There was no apology that day, no detailed confession. Instead, the suspect spoke about fear, fear of exposure, fear of consequences, fear that grew heavier with every passing year. They admitted believing that time would erase everything, that the world would move on. "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough," the suspect said, "it would disappear." That belief had shaped every decision that followed the crime. Minimal involvement in searches, controlled cooperation with police, relocation, routine, blending in. The judge responded firmly. "You didn't just take a life," the judge said. "You stole decades of truth from a family." The sentence reflected that judgment. Decades in prison, long enough that the freedom once protected by silence would never be regained. As the hearing concluded, Linda's family spoke briefly. They did not focus on anger, they spoke of memory, of who Linda was before she became a case file, before she became evidence. Outside the courthouse, Wichita once again absorbed the weight of what had been revealed. The crime had not been hidden by complexity, but by familiarity, by the assumption that danger looks unfamiliar. The sentencing didn't bring peace, but it brought finality. And with that finality came one last responsibility. Remembering Linda not for how she died, but for who she was. Rehook. In Part 20, we look at the legacy of the Linda Parker case, how it changed investigations, reshaped community trust, and ensured that one voice lost in 1992 would never be forgotten again.
Long after the sentencing concluded and the courtroom emptied, the impact of the Linda Parker case continued to ripple through Wichita. Some stories end with a verdict. This one did not. It left behind lessons, uncomfortable, necessary, and enduring. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point. Training sessions revisited the investigation not to assign blame, but to understand how limitations of the past shaped outcomes. Detectives spoke openly about missed opportunities, about how reliance on intuition without forensic support had once narrowed the scope too quickly. The case reinforced a truth now central to modern policing. Patience paired with persistence can resurrect even the coldest trail. Procedures changed. Missing person cases involving adults were no longer dismissed as quickly. Early deviations from routine were taken more seriously. And perhaps most importantly, investigators learned to look inward, to examine familiar faces with the same scrutiny once reserved for strangers. For the community, the case altered perception. People spoke about trust differently after that. The idea that danger must come from outside had been shattered. The realization that someone capable of hiding such a crime could live openly among them forced residents to confront how little we truly know about those around us. Yet the case also restored something that had been lost: faith. Faith that truth, even delayed, can still emerge. Faith that silence does not equal safety. Faith that technology and determination can close gaps once thought permanent. Linda's family chose to honor her in quiet ways. A memorial near the riverbank, scholarships in her name, stories shared not about her disappearance but about her laughter, her routines, her kindness. They refused to let her identity remain only tied to tragedy. In schools and training rooms, Linda Parker's name became more than a case study. It became a reminder that predictability can be exploited, that trust must be earned, that justice has no expiration date. Years later, the construction site along the Arkansas River looks unremarkable again. Cars pass, people walk. Few know what once lay beneath the soil. Fewer still understand how close the truth came to staying buried forever. But it didn't, because someone kept asking questions, because someone refused to let time win. Linda Parker's story now stands as proof that even when answers take decades, they are still worth waiting for. Final rehook. In the next and final part, we revisit the case from the beginning, revealing why this story still matters today and how many other truths may still be waiting beneath the surface.
Some stories end when the evidence is filed away and the courtroom lights dim. Others linger, quietly, persistently, because they carry lessons that refuse to fade. The story of Linda Parker is one of those. When Linda vanished in September 1992, her disappearance blended into a category no family ever wants to hear: unsolved. Over time, hope thinned, witnesses moved away, and memories dulled. The city adjusted, life continued, and yet beneath the surface, the truth remained exactly where it had been left, waiting. What ultimately solved the case was not luck, it was time combined with refusal. Refusal to accept that unanswered questions should stay unanswered. Refusal to let a life be reduced to a file number. Refusal to believe that silence equals innocence. The barrel discovered along the Arkansas riverbank was not just physical evidence, it was a message from the past. It reminded investigators that concealment is not confirmation of success, and that crimes committed carefully can still unravel when patience outlasts fear. Linda's case also revealed something more unsettling: how easily familiarity can shield wrongdoing. The person responsible did not fit the image people expect when they imagine danger. That misconception, shared by communities everywhere, was one of the strongest protections the killer ever had. But even that protection had limits. Modern forensic science bridged the gap between what could be suspected in 1992 and what could be proven decades later. Fibers, soil, material analysis, and interview psychology transformed fragments into certainty. Technology gave Linda a voice when time had taken everything else. For investigators, the case reinforced a vital truth. Cold cases are not inactive cases. They are paused conversations, and with the right tools, those conversations can resume. For families of the missing, Linda Parker's story became something rare, evidence that answers are still possible even when years have passed. That persistence matters, that pressure matters, that silence does not mean the end. And for those who believe time erases responsibility, the case delivered a final, undeniable message. It doesn't. Time remembers. So does the ground. So do the people who refuse to stop asking why. Linda Parker was more than a disappearance. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with routines and plans that never got the chance to unfold. Justice did not arrive quickly, but it arrived truthfully. And that truth now stands where silence once lived. Closing hook for reflection. If this case teaches us anything, it's this: some truths don't surface when we expect them to. They surface when we're finally ready to listen.